You waking up one morning and discovering that the last few hours of your life have simply vanished. You know your own name. You recognize your family. You remember where you grew up. But every conversation that happened just moments ago disappears almost as soon as it ends. Your wife tells you that you've already asked where you are 10 times. Your children insist you've been repeating the same questions for an hour. You stare at them in confusion because, to you, this is the very first time you've asked. Now imagine this happening not today, but 3,000 years ago. There are no hospitals, no neurologists, no brain scans, no concept of memory being stored inside the brain. Only frightened family members trying to understand what they have just witnessed. If you suddenly lost the ability to remember the present, what would they think had happened to you? For most of human history, the answer wasn't disease. It wasn't a damaged brain. It wasn't interrupted blood flow. Across many ancient civilizations, sudden episodes of memory loss were explained through religion, mythology, or supernatural forces because no biological explanation yet existed. The remarkable part is that cultures separated by thousands of kilometers often reached surprisingly similar conclusions. Today, however, neurologists recognize a real condition that sounds astonishingly similar. It's called Transient Global Amnesia, or simply TGA. Although the name sounds frightening, the condition is usually temporary. A person suddenly loses the ability to form new memories. They repeatedly ask the same questions because every answer disappears almost immediately, yet they remain awake. They know who they are. They recognize familiar faces. They can speak normally. They simply cannot hold on to the present. The episode typically lasts a few hours and always resolves within 24 hours. Afterwards, the person recovers almost completely, except for a permanent blank spot covering the event itself. In 1990, neurologists John Hodges and Charles Warlow published one of the most influential clinical studies of transient global amnesia in the journal Brain. After examining hundreds of patients, they established the diagnostic criteria still used today, showing that the condition is usually temporary and leaves no lasting neurological damage. Even today, doctors don't fully understand why it happens. Researchers have proposed several possible mechanisms. Some studies point toward brief dysfunction within the hippocampus, a small structure deep inside the temporal lobe that is essential for forming new memories. Others suggest migraine-related changes, temporary disturbances in blood flow, or short-lived metabolic stress affecting hippocampal neurons. A landmark review published in the journal Brain by Pauline Quinet and colleagues examined decades of transient global amnesia research. Modern MRI scans sometimes reveal tiny transient abnormalities in the hippocampus after an episode, but no single theory explains every case. Current research therefore views TGA as a multifactorial condition rather than a disease with one simple cause. That uncertainty is worth remembering, because if 21st century neuroscience still debates the precise cause, imagine trying to explain the same event 4,000 years ago. The oldest civilizations on Earth had no concept of neurons, no knowledge of electrical signals inside the brain, no understanding of memory circuits. Instead, they interpreted extraordinary experiences using the only framework available to them, the supernatural. But here's something fascinating. Ancient people were not simply inventing random stories. They were careful observers. They saw the same symptoms we see today. A healthy person suddenly behaving in a way that made no sense. Someone speaking normally, walking normally, looking completely conscious, yet somehow unable to remember what had just happened. The observations were real, only the explanations were different, and nowhere is that clearer than in ancient Mesopotamia. More than 3,500 years ago, cities flourished between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was the birthplace of writing, mathematics, recorded law, and some of humanity's earliest surviving medical traditions. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia reveal a world where illness and religion were deeply connected. When something happened that could not be explained naturally, the first question was rarely, what failed inside the body? Instead, it was, which god caused this? Among these ancient texts appears an intriguing word, Mahu. Modern Assyriologists usually translate it as someone seized, inspired, or possessed by a deity during an ecstatic religious experience. The exact translation remains debated, but the idea is remarkably consistent. A person enters an altered state, speaks words they themselves do not understand, acts under what observers believed was divine influence, and afterwards appears to have little or no awareness of what occurred. One prayer even describes someone lamenting that they had become like a mahu, bringing forth words they did not know. Assyriologist Martti Nissinen, one of the leading scholars of ancient Near Eastern prophecy, argues that the Mesopotamian mahu should be understood as an ecstatic religious specialist rather than a patient with a neurological illness. Some historians suggest the descriptions resemble post-trance amnesia, but none claim these texts describe modern transient global amnesia. That distinction matters. It's tempting to imagine ancient Mesopotamians recording the world's first cases of TGA. But the evidence doesn't support that conclusion. The surviving texts describe ecstatic religious experiences rather than clinical neurological episodes. Still, the similarities are striking. In both cases, witnesses observed someone behaving normally in many respects, while later remembering little or nothing of the experience. To modern neuroscience, these are different phenomena. To an ancient observer, they could easily appear identical. Imagine standing inside a temple nearly 4,000 years ago. A priestess suddenly begins speaking with complete confidence. Her voice changes. Her behavior changes. The crowd falls silent. Every word is believed to come directly from a god. Hours later, someone asks her about the prophecy. She simply stares back. She has no memory of saying any of it. Without neuroscience, what conclusion would you reach? Mesopotamian society answered with certainty. The gods had briefly borrowed her voice. And if the experience appeared dangerous rather than sacred, specialists known today as exorcist priests performed elaborate rituals, prayers, and incantations intended to remove harmful supernatural influences. While no surviving text specifically describes an exorcism as a treatment for TGA, ritual healing formed a central part of Mesopotamian responses to unexplained disorders. Travel west into ancient Egypt, and the mystery of memory becomes even more fascinating, because the Egyptians looked in an entirely different place. Today, if you asked where memory lives, almost everyone would point to the brain. Ancient Egyptians probably would not. For them, the heart, the ib, was the center of intelligence, personality, morality, and memory itself. The brain held surprisingly little importance by comparison. During mummification, embalmers often removed and discarded the brain, while the heart was carefully preserved for the afterlife because it was believed to contain the person's identity and memory. That belief shaped everything. If memory disappeared, the problem wasn't inside the skull, it was inside the heart. One of Egypt's most famous medical documents, the Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE, contains references translated as vanishing of the mind and forgetfulness of the mind. Rather than describing damaged brain tissue, these conditions were attributed to hostile supernatural forces entering the body. The treatments combined herbal medicine with religious practice. Recipes included ingredients such as honey, figs, lotus, and valerian, while protective rituals attempted to remove the unseen cause of the illness. Heart-shaped amulets were also widely used because the heart itself was regarded as the seat of memory and identity. Were these treatments effective against TGA? Almost certainly not. But that's the wrong question. The better question is, why did intelligent civilizations independently connect unexplained memory loss with invisible forces? The answer may be surprisingly simple, because the event itself is almost impossible to explain if you don't know how the brain works. Imagine watching someone who looks completely healthy. They speak fluently. They recognize everyone around them. They can walk, eat, and think. Yet every conversation disappears seconds after it happens. Nothing about the outside of the body explains what you're seeing. The injury is invisible. So the explanation naturally became invisible too. Gods, spirits, sacred breath, divine punishment. Not because ancient people were irrational, but because they were trying to explain an invisible problem with the only invisible causes they knew. And this pattern wasn't limited to Mesopotamia or Egypt. Across the Mediterranean, another civilization transformed forgetting into one of the most enduring symbols in human mythology. Not an illness, not a curse, but an entire river whose waters could erase every memory you had ever possessed. And that river would become one of the most famous symbols of forgetfulness in all of history. The Greeks imagined something extraordinary, a place where memories did not simply fade with time. They could be erased completely, not by disease, not by injury, but by crossing a single river. Its name was Lethe. To the ancient Greeks, Lethe was one of the rivers of the underworld. Souls preparing for rebirth drank from its waters so they would forget their previous lives before returning to the world of the living. The story appears in Greek mythology, later Orphic traditions, and Roman literature, including Plato's philosophical writings and Virgil's Aeneid. At first glance, this sounds like nothing more than a myth, but historians see something deeper. The Greeks weren't trying to describe a neurological disorder. They were asking one of humanity's oldest questions. How is it possible to lose an entire lifetime of memories? Long before anyone understood neurons or the hippocampus, memory itself had become one of philosophy's greatest mysteries. How could something so important simply disappear? To answer that question, Greek thinkers imagined memory as something almost physical, not stored inside the brain, but woven into the soul itself. If memory belonged to the soul, then perhaps forgetting required more than time. Perhaps it required crossing into another world. This wasn't medicine, it was philosophy wrapped inside mythology. Yet while Lethe belonged to the dead, another mystery belonged to the living. Throughout the Greek world, temples dedicated to Apollo attracted pilgrims seeking answers from the gods. The most famous stood high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the Oracle of Delphi. People traveled hundreds of miles, kings, generals, merchants, entire city-states, all hoping that one woman, the Pythia, could reveal the future. Ancient writers describe the Pythia entering an altered state before delivering Apollo's messages. Plato likewise remarks that inspired prophets and seers often speak truths beyond their own understanding. Later, Greek and Roman authors also associated divine inspiration with ecstatic states in which ordinary awareness appeared suspended. Modern historians, however, urge caution. These accounts were religious texts and philosophical writings. They are not medical case reports. No ancient author describes the Pythia experiencing transient global amnesia, nor do they claim every oracle forgot what had happened. Instead, many scholars interpret these descriptions as examples of ecstatic religious trance, a phenomenon documented in cultures around the world. Anthropologists studying trance states have found that some participants later report partial or complete amnesia for the experience, while others remember everything clearly. The experiences vary enormously. That distinction is important. It prevents us from forcing modern diagnoses onto ancient stories. Yet imagine standing inside Delphi over 2,000 years ago. You witness a woman speaking with complete confidence. Her words are unlike ordinary conversation. The crowd listens in silence. Hours later, she appears exhausted. Whether she remembers every detail, only fragments, or nothing at all, one conclusion seems obvious to everyone present. Apollo himself had spoken. The Greeks were not witnessing disease. They believed they were witnessing divinity. Today, neuroscience offers a completely different explanation for altered states of consciousness. Researchers distinguish between epilepsy, dissociation, meditative trance, sleep disorders, and neurological syndromes such as transient global amnesia. Although some outward behaviors may appear similar, they arise from very different biological mechanisms. Modern neurologists therefore caution against identifying ancient prophetic experiences as examples of TGA. The historical evidence simply does not support such a diagnosis. Travel east now, across mountains, across deserts, into ancient India. Here, forgetting became something far more personal. One of Sanskrit literature's greatest love stories tells of King Dushyanta and a young woman named Shakuntala. Most people know only the ending. Very few know what caused their separation. In Kalidasa's celebrated play Abhijnana Sakuntalam, Shakuntala becomes so lost in thoughts of the king that she accidentally ignores the sage Durvasa. The sage responds with a terrible curse. The man she loves will completely forget her. Not because his heart changes, not because he chooses another life. His memory itself is taken away. Later, when Shakuntala finally stands before him, the king looks directly into her eyes and sees a stranger. Only after a lost ring is recovered does the curse break, allowing every memory to return at once. This is one of the most famous stories of forgetfulness in world literature, but historians point out an important detail. The curse does not appear in the oldest version of the story preserved in the Mahabharata. It was introduced centuries later by the poet Kalidasa, who transformed the narrative into a dramatic exploration of love, destiny, and memory. That tells us something remarkable. By Kalidasa's time, memory itself had become powerful enough to drive an entire tragedy. For ancient audiences, forgetting was not merely inconvenient. It could destroy families, break kingdoms, erase identities. Ayurvedic medicine approached memory from a different perspective. Classical medical texts discussed smriti, memory, as one of the essential functions of a healthy mind. Herbs, diet, meditation, and balanced living were all believed to strengthen mental function. Yet the surviving medical literature does not contain a clear description matching modern transient global amnesia. Sudden, complete memory loss remained far more common in mythology than in medicine. Then comes perhaps the most haunting story of all. Ancient China imagined that forgetting happened not during life, but before every new life began. According to later Chinese Buddhist tradition, every soul approaching reincarnation meets an old woman named Meng Po. She offers a single bowl of soup, one drink, and every memory disappears. Parents, friends, wars, victories, entire lifetimes vanish forever. Only then may the soul begin again. The legend of Meng Po developed in later Chinese religious traditions and became one of East Asia's most enduring symbols of forgetfulness. Rather than explaining illness, it explains why humans cannot remember previous lives. Chinese medicine, however, followed a different path. Rather than locating memory inside the brain, classical physicians described mental function through the interaction of the heart, the shen, vital energy, or qi, and the balance of yin and yang. When memory became disturbed, treatments aimed to restore harmony using herbal remedies, acupuncture, ritual practices, and spiritual healing rather than neurological intervention. Notice what has happened. Mesopotamia connected unexplained behavior to divine possession. Egypt located memory within the heart. Greece imagined rivers that erased identity. India transformed forgetting into a curse. China explained it through reincarnation. 5 civilizations. 5 entirely different worldviews, yet each struggled with exactly the same mystery. How could a healthy person suddenly lose access to memory? Modern neuroscience finally offers part of the answer. Memory is not stored in one single location. It is built through networks linking the hippocampus with many other regions of the brain. During an episode of Transient Global Amnesia, these networks temporarily fail to create new lasting memories, even though language, personality, and older memories remain largely intact. Brain imaging studies have repeatedly identified small, temporary abnormalities within the hippocampus after many TGA episodes, supporting the idea that this structure plays a central role. Yet researchers still debate exactly why these changes occur. Some suspect migraine-related mechanisms. Others point toward temporary metabolic stress or brief disturbances affecting memory circuits. No single explanation accounts for every patient. Even in the 21st century, the mystery is not completely solved. Perhaps that is the most humbling lesson of all. It is easy to look back at ancient civilizations and dismiss their explanations, to smile at stories of gods, curses, or rivers of forgetfulness. But those stories were born from genuine observation. Ancient people saw something profoundly real. A person who appeared completely awake, completely healthy, yet somehow disconnected from the present. Without microscopes, without MRI scanners, without neuroscience. They searched for answers using the only tools they possessed: religion, philosophy, poetry, and myth. Thousands of years later, our explanations have changed. Our technology has transformed. Our understanding of the brain has grown beyond anything the ancient world could imagine. Yet one remarkable truth remains. Scientists can describe what happens during transient global amnesia with extraordinary precision. They can identify the brain regions involved. They can predict recovery. They can reassure frightened families that the condition is usually benign. But when it comes to the deepest question of all, why does this strange phenomenon happen in the first place? Even modern medicine still doesn't have every answer, and perhaps that is why the ancient stories continue to fascinate us. Because somewhere between mythology and neuroscience lies a mystery that humanity has been trying to understand for thousands of years.